there's some new AI program that is able to predict what decision a person's going to make in a particular setting 5 to 10 seconds before they make the decision, and it's up to like a 90% accuracy.
Wow.
And it really furthers, that idea of determinism is like, put up by people like Robert Sapolsky in his book Determined and things. It's just like, I just, there's something about it. Like my litmus test, or the filters that I run through on like a belief system on whether or not I would like to participate in that belief system, is typically like, does it help? Does it harm other people? And is it useful for me to believe? And determinism is one of those things that I don't feel like it's super useful, because it seems like it takes autonomy away from an individual, which it seems like a path that can only lead to nihilism, and I don't understand how it doesn't.
Well, let me give you a little counter.
Please do.
Because I think you're right. It has that danger of nihilism. And you're like, well, why should I do anything except sit on the couch and eat Fritos, because it's all determined. On the other hand, I lean towards determinism, but I'm still very much out there doing things, because I know that eating Fritos, it may be determined, but it's not going to get me what I want. Second, I think determinism is very helpful and useful when dealing with others and having compassion for bad luck. Because luck, like you said, there's so many things that go into success. There's intelligence, emotional EQ, but also luck. They're some of the most brilliant, hardworking, emotionally brilliant people, but they just had a run of bad luck. And so having a more determinist view that, you know what, it was not meant to be for them. It
wasn't in the cards.
It wasn't in the cards. And so let's have a little compassion instead of saying, you lazy idiot.
Right.
You didn't achieve what I achieved.
It definitely helps you have a higher level of empathy. And that's kind of what I wrestle with, is like, you ever heard the phrase, when you're born, you look like your parents. When you die, you look like your choices.
No, that's a good one. Because the idea is like, if you're
born into circumstances,
right?
But then when you die, you are a product of the choices that you make,
right?
But the question that I wrestle with is, when does it switch? Because like, you can't, if you continue to blame your circumstances for 70 years, that's probably not a productive use of your time.
True.
But also there is some sort of recognition. If you're So I grew up in this a very fundamentalist Baptist background.
Interesting.
So a little culty, other people would call it a cult. I sometimes call it a cult because it's easier to just explain to people what it is, because saying I grew up going to church doesn't tell people exactly what it was. This is in Southern California, of all places.
Oh, interesting.
LA County. And there's a documentary that came out on this thing, and actually my producer Eric Skorzynski's hosts a podcast called Preacher Boys, and it's kind of a deep dive into abuse that exists within the independent fundamental Baptist movement across the country. And HBO doc came out on it, and Eric is kind of the main talking head as far as like being an expert in that space.
Wow.
And there was one of the girls that was one of the victims that they were kind of highlighting in that documentary. She was talking about her parents ran this camp for troubled teens, and just some of the stuff that they did was just so terrible. But when she was a teenager, she was actively participating in, being the oppressor in that particular situation before she, really knew. And it's like, how responsible is she for her actions at that point in her life?
Right.
Because when you're born, like you said, you're born, you look like your parents or your circumstances. When you die, you look like your choices. And now she's made the choices and she's become, aware of those things. But leading up to a certain point, you're like, hey, if I were raised in that same frame with those parents telling me that these are the things that are not just okay to do, but like morally correct, like you are righteous in doing these things and called by God to do them, and you can definitely do these things, I would probably be doing those same things. Like it's really easy to point the finger and be like, like the Nazi soldier, example that everybody uses. It's really easy to point the finger and be like, there's no way. But, to a certain extent, we would all be victim of that, a victim of that circumstance. But the question is, at what point, like I said, at what point does it switch?
Right.
At what point, because if she's 38 and still doing those things, it's like, okay, well, you're actively choosing this now. It's not just like you were born into this circumstance. So that's kind of the question that I wrestle with a lot, is like, well, at what point does it become you versus just your circumstance?
Well, it is a fascinating question. I mean, one thing that I find useful is questioning my own biases and trying not to have motivational reasoning. So, I am...
Motivational reasoning, can you define what that is?
Sure. It's when you read something in the newspaper and you only see what you want to see. So if it's an article about the pros and cons of the death penalty and you're anti-death penalty, you only see, I knew death penalty was terrible.
Yeah.
So trying to overcome that, I think, is very helpful in getting beyond. Because I agree. If my parents had watched Fox News, it wasn't around, but the equivalent of Fox News, I would probably be a conservative. And since I grew up in sort of a liberal home, I sort of lean that way, but I try to take a step back and say, let's not be a knee-jerk liberal. Let's look at the big picture and try to get away from my own biases, what really will be better for the world. And I don't agree with liberals on many issues. It's not a one axis. We shouldn't say liberal and conservative. They're like 100 issues, and each one has its pros and cons.
Yeah, I hate the idea of being lumped into a bucket because of a letter next to your name on a voter registration card.
Right.
It's just like, well, it's so hard to just define a person as being this way, because then all of a sudden you disagree and then you get kicked out.
Yeah, exactly. And it's only 2 in America.
Right.
And the founding fathers did not want that. The founders, James Madison, wanted it to be more like Europe, where they'll have a parliament with several different parties. He thought that there were going to be all these different factions and they would all fight and they would all ally and have moving alliances. But it settled into this duopoly, which is, I think, terrible for our country.
Do you think it's possible in the next few decades to move away from that?
It's a great question. I hope so. I just read an interesting New York Times article about how to do it, and a lot of it has to do with changing the way we vote, so that whether it's instead of the ranked choice voting might help. But I hope so, because this is a terrible system.
Yes.
Like nothing is black and white or just has 2 sides. They have multiple sides.
Yeah, the polarity is just sickening sometimes.
It's the worst.
Especially during election years. It's just, you can't get away from it.
No.
Yeah.